We left off the presentation on the fall of Rome with the idea that the Roman Empire had collapsed, that civilization in this part of the empire, the western part of the empire, had essentially come to an end. The whole thing had fallen apart. And left off with the idea that this part of what had been the Roman Empire, it's a very different story. That's because there are very few barbarian incursions into the eastern part of the empire. And that's again because of those mountain ranges that lie across here, and then the desert down here. And there's just going to be very few barbarians who will make it over in the eastern part of what had been the Roman Empire, and the people living there are going to be able to defend themselves much better than people in the western part of the empire. And although the political structure of the empire collapses, civilization itself does not collapse in the eastern part of what had been the Roman Empire. And it's a very different story. And that's the story of the Byzantine world. On this map, you see over here some barbarian kingdoms. The kingdom of the Ostrogoths, the Franks up here, the Visigoths over here, the Vandals over here. What's in purple is what's called the Byzantine Empire. I'm not sure you can make that out on the PowerPoint slide there. But what's in purple there is what's called the Byzantine Empire, or an older name for this part of the world, the Eastern Roman Empire. That's kind of an old-fashioned term for what today we more commonly call where'd it go? The Byzantine Empire. That word Eastern Roman Empire, that phrase, Eastern Roman Empire, was a useful phrase, is a useful phrase, because it reminds us that the Byzantine Empire is essentially the eastern part of what had been the Roman Empire, but it also implies that the Roman Empire is still around, and the Roman Empire has collapsed, and a new empire has developed to fill the power void, and that's what's called the Byzantine Empire. So Eastern Roman Empire is kind of old-fashioned, and more today you hear it called the Byzantine Empire. That word Byzantine comes from the name of the capital of this empire, a city which has had 3 different names during its history. Originally, the city was called Constantinople, built by and named for Constantine, an emperor we talked about in the course. He's the emperor who legalized Christianity. He builds this city. I'll show you where the city is in just a minute. He builds this city as a second capital for an administrative center for the eastern part of the empire. At the time we're talking about, the city is more commonly called Byzantium. And today, the same city, a very important Turkish city of Istanbul. A city which has had 3 different names in its history. That's not uncommon for cities to change their names for various reasons. And the time we're talking about, the city is more commonly called Byzantium. Constantinople, Byzantium, Istanbul, right here on the map, right where, I'm trying to draw an arrow. There we go. Right where Turkey is today and where Greece is today almost touch each other. You have a map on page 32 which is similar to this map, illustrating the usual territories of the Byzantine Empire. Well, you're going to like the Byzantine world because it goes by for us pretty quickly. There's not an awful lot that I think you need to know about the Byzantine world to meet the requirements for this course. If you think back to the first day of class, I told you that this course, HUM 1020, is organized to give you part of the core knowledge that's expected of college graduates. And I don't think there's a lot that comes out of the Byzantine world that really fits into that category. It's an interesting time period, an interesting place, an interesting time period, all kinds of things to talk about. In a world history course, we'd spend a lot more time in the Byzantine world, but for us and the way that this course is organized, I don't think there's that much that we really need to go into. There's really only 2 people's names to know about, and you have to think about these 2 people together, Justinian and Theodora. Justinian and Theodora, they are the emperor and empress of the Byzantine Empire at its height. And as far as I can tell, they're really the first political couple in world history. By that I mean that they share power. Usually it's either the king really runs everything and the queen just hangs around the palace looking pretty, or else the queen really runs everything and the king just hangs around the palace looking pretty. One way or the other. But Justinian and Theodora will come to share power, possibly because they have an awful lot of power to share. Justinian and Theodora will control the food distribution system. They will use Julius Caesar's old trick. They'll come to control the food supply. They'll control the banking industry. They'll control the shipping industry in the Mediterranean world. They'll control the church as far as the Byzantine Empire is concerned. There's a complete unity of church and state in the Byzantine world. The Byzantine Empire will be a Christian empire. Justinian and Theodora will appoint pastors of local churches, have that much control over the church. For us in this course, I think there's really only two things to associate with Justinian and Theodora. One is that Justinian himself takes on the job of reorganizing the law codes, taking the legal ideas that he'd inherited from the Roman Empire and reorganizing the law. That reorganization of the law becomes the foundation of Western legal culture. Here's a copy of Justinian's law codes from the 14th century. That's about 800 years after Justinian's death, and his law code is still being written, copied, and used because it provides the foundation of Western law. If you're interested in law, maybe you're going to go to law school someday. Please don't, but you might if you have to. But you might be interested in our paralegal program here. You might be taking courses in criminal justice, or a lot of you are going to be taking that business law course over in Building 2. Well, the basic divisions in the law, the three basic divisions, contracts, torts, and criminal law. Distinctions between different laws, like the distinction between a felony and a misdemeanor, are different degrees of crimes. Those definitions and those distinctions largely come out of Justinian's law codes. So if you're interested in legal kind of stuff, then you're going to want to know more about Justinian's law codes than the rest of us do. The other thing this couple does, Justinian and Theodora do, is to organize the construction of a building called the Hagia Sophia. You have several photographs of the Hagia Sophia on page 33 in your textbook. I've got some others here on the screen to show you. The Hagia Sophia. That name, Hagia Sophia, is a Greek phrase. Greek is the official language of the Byzantine Empire. That's another leftover of Alexander the Great's old empire. The phrase Hagia Sophia, Hagia is a Greek word that means holy. Sophia is a Greek word that means wisdom. It's sometimes called the Church of Holy Wisdom, but usually just called the Hagia Sophia. It was intentionally built to be the largest place of worship in the Christian religion, in other words, the largest church in Christianity. And it held that title for several hundred years. I've got some other views of the Hagia Sophia for you here. Here's a nice wide-angle lens view of the building. Things are distorted a little bit in the photograph, but it's kind of pretty. Thank you to nationalgeographic.com. I have here, you have several photographs on page 33. I've got here a diagram of the church. Here would be the atrium, down here, the courtyard outside the church. You would, let me get rid of that. Here's the double doors entering into the narthex area here. And then there's another set of double doors. You'd enter into the nave back here. And then the apse back here somewhere. Actually, that's kind of confusing. Forget I did that. No, bad teacher. Bad teacher. There. It is in the shape of a cross. You can see the transepts here. I think you can make that out, that add the cross shape to the building. Maybe that was less helpful than I thought it was going to be. Anyway, there you have a sketch of the building, and I hope you can make out some of the parts of traditional Christian architecture that I gave you in an earlier presentation. And another view, actually this is the one we started off with, isn't it? The Hagia Sophia. As you look at the building, though, some of you may recognize something that tells you what you're looking at is definitely not a Christian church. And those are the four towers on the corners of the building that look kind of like spaceships getting ready to take off. Those towers are called minarets. And you see the word minaret on the screen there. Minarets mark the building as a Muslim mosque, a place of worship in Islam. Part of the story of the Byzantine Empire is that the Byzantine Empire is conquered by the Muslim Empire, much later than what we're talking about today. And this Christian empire, the Byzantine Empire, is converted to a Muslim empire. And part of that process is taking this very large church, the Hagia Sophia, and converting it to a Muslim mosque. So the minarets are later additions. The minarets mark the building as a mosque. The purpose of the minarets is that religious leaders climb those towers 5 times a day and call out prayers over the city, so that at least theoretically everybody in the city is praying along and meeting the requirement of Islam to pray 5 times a day. You have also in your textbook a photograph. This is page 34, I think. No, 33, I'm sorry. On page 33 you have some photographs. We'll get caught up here. Let's see. Where's my cursor? There we go. On page 33 you have several photographs of the interior of the Hagia Sophia. I've got some others here to show you on the screen. It's a very large structure. I've got several views on the screen for you now. Down here in the smaller view you're looking towards what had been the old apse of the church down here, where the high altar had been before it was taken out. Over here you have the location of the pulpit, since replaced in terms of its use. So you have several photographs there of the Hagia Sophia. But the Hagia Sophia doesn't work the way it was designed to work. It doesn't look the way it was designed to look. To try to imagine how it was originally designed to look, you have to use your imagination a little bit. From the floor to the ceiling, originally the walls were covered with a type of art called mosaics. I've got on the screen here a mosaic for you to look at. We'll talk about mosaics in more detail in a later presentation. But mosaics are images or designs made by gluing little pieces of stuff to the wall. In this case, the mosaics were made up of little groups of little pieces of broken glass of different colors glued to the wall. In this photograph, you actually have a photograph of a mosaic that was on the wall in the Hagia Sophia. In a matter of restoration, some plaster was scraped off the wall, and this photograph was taken before it was covered up again. But you can see this is one of the original mosaics. And maybe you can make out the different colors of glass that are used, glued to the wall to make up the picture. Well, from the floor to the ceiling, these walls are coated with broken pieces of glass and all kinds of pictures and designs. And then you picture the sunlight coming through the windows. You see a beam of sunlight coming through there. And then this was originally designed as a church building, so there was almost constant incense smoke and a candle smoke and oil lamp smoke. And even in this photograph there's a little bit of smoky haze in the air. And you had to picture that beam of light reflecting off the glass on the wall back into the room, almost shotgunning off the wall into the room with little pieces of color picked up as it reflects off the broken glass, and then those little pieces of color dancing in the haze and the smoky haze as the air comes through the building, almost like a laser light show up above the head. Way up above the head. From the floor to the ceiling is 180 feet. That's an 18-story building that you could fit inside the Hagia Sophia. It's a huge building. Here I have a architectural detail of the building, which maybe isn't all that useful. The architecture majors will find it more interesting than the rest of us will. But the Hagia Sophia is a significant building. As a part of the process of converting it to a Muslim mosque, those mosaics were taken off the wall. It's one of the rules in Islam that you can't have images inside a mosque. And so those mosaics were either covered up with plaster, as I mentioned earlier, or just scraped off the wall, because they told stories from the Christian story, and because also that rule in Islam that you can't have images inside a mosque. And so it doesn't look the way it was designed to work, but still an incredibly impressive building. If you are interested in architecture, you want to know more about the building than the rest of us, The weight of that dome being carried down to the floor through a series of arches and domes is a difficult engineering problem. And if you're interested, you want to know more than the rest of us do. But a significant building for everyone to remember. It has served as both the largest place of worship for both Christianity and Islam, and held that title for both religions for several hundred years. Well, the dominant form of the visual arts in the Byzantine world were mosaics. On the screen, you see a photograph of a mosaic you have on page 34 in your textbook. It's another depiction of Jesus. We still have the beardless appearance, but the hairstyle and the clothing reflect the fashions of the Byzantine world in the 5th century. Another portrayal of Jesus as a good shepherd, and I mentioned that portrayal to you in the presentation on early Christian art. Well, mosaics were the dominant form of the visual arts in the Byzantine world. If you had traveled back to the Byzantine world, you would have seen all kinds of mosaics. Most of them have long since been destroyed, but some of them have survived. Mosaics are made by gluing little pieces of stuff to the wall to make the image. Broken glass, porcelain tiles, very common, seashells, rocks, pieces of metal, bone, just about anything you can imagine that makes sense to glue to the wall. Goldfish, maybe not such a good idea. Squirrels don't work. But things that make sense. We got a fancy name for the little pieces of things that are glued to the wall to make the picture. We call them tesserae. Tesserae, that word refers to those little pieces of tile, glass, stone, whatever, that's glued to the wall to make up the image. Today, that word tesserae has taken on a metaphorical meaning, usually referring to little pieces of information, that when you put those little pieces of information together, it all comes together to form the big picture. If you understand how mosaics work, then you see how that word tesserae works to refer to little pieces of information that when you put them together make up the big picture. Well, we've got several examples of mosaics in your textbook to look at. On page, starting on page 30, stick with me, 34, there we go. On page 34 you have this photograph, Jesus the Good Shepherd. You've got some others to look at on that spread as we look through here. Here's another example of mosaics. Here's some others. Some you recognize from your text. You see there in your textbook. Others I've just chosen to show you here. Another collection of mosaics here. If you look carefully, right here, you have the mosaic which you see on page 36 in your textbook. And over here, the mosaic that you see on page 37 in your textbooks. Here, page 36, figure 6-9, you have a depiction of Justinian, Emperor Justinian, on the wall of that church. To put an image of yourself up in the church indicates a little bit of Justinian's ego. He has advisors from the military over here. If you look right here, you recognize that symbol. Within the shield there you see the Chi Rho. You have the Chi and the Rho. See how much stuff you're learning? Over here you have some governmental advisors, some advisors from the church over here. The head of the church underneath Justinian and Theodora was the Archbishop Maximinius, whose name you see here, indicating that this man has been appointed to head up the church by the emperor. And of course on page 37 you have the matching mosaic, of course you do, of Empress Theodora. Empress Theodora has her entourage over here. She has advisors from the church here. If you look carefully, you'll see that Theodora is handing the deacon here, you can tell he's a deacon from the striped vestment there, she's handing the deacon a chalice, the cup that's used in the Eucharistic service. You see his authority to bear the chalice is given to him by the empress, by Theodora. And that's symbolic there of Justinian and Theodora's dominance of the church. On page 37, you also have a detail from this mosaic. If you haven't figured out what I mean yet by tesserae and little pieces of things glued to the wall, then maybe this helps you. Well, the mosaics were the dominant form of the visual arts in the Byzantine world. Like I said, if you could go back in time, you would have seen a lot of them. But there's a problem with the mosaics, or at least from one perspective there's a problem. And that is that it's difficult to make, in fact impossible, to make a mosaic that looks real. I mean, looking at the mosaic here of Theodora, we recognize the facial features, we recognize the femininity in the face, we recognize the jewelry and the costuming, the headdress, and that kind of thing. But she doesn't quite look like a real woman. I think if you left the classroom and went down the hall and saw this woman walking down the hallway towards you, you might jump back in the classroom real fast. It's almost like a space alien trying to pretend to be a woman who has a vague notion of what a woman looks like. It doesn't quite look real. And it's difficult to capture something that looks real in a mosaic. On that page, page 37, for example, figure 611, you have this mosaic. We can make out the scene well enough. Here we have Jesus calling two of his disciples, Peter and Andrew. They had been fishermen. He's calling them to be his disciples. We see Jesus there standing on the shore. He has a halo around his head, a symbol of sacredness, holiness, specialness. He's there in the purple robe, calling Peter and Andrew to be his disciples, like full-time disciples. You see them out in the water fishing in their boats, but it doesn't quite look like a real scene. That boat looks awfully close to the shore to be using a net like that. I'm not quite sure how those two men are fitting into the boat. It's almost like the boat is hovering on top of the water. If you look at Jesus' feet, he's doing that ballet move where you stand on the tips of your toes. It doesn't quite work in the sense that it doesn't look real. You can make mosaics that look pretty, okay. I'm just saying that, well, you just can't make things that look very real. But possibly it's because that the dominant form of the visual arts in the Byzantine world were the mosaics, that leads to the development of a second type of visual art to associate with the Byzantine world, and those are icons. You have a good example of the icon on page 38 in your textbook. Christos Pantocrator, Christ the ruler of everything. In Greek, the ruler of the universe, we might translate Pantocrator. A good example of an icon, a very famous example of an icon. This is one with a very rich history. You have some little bit about the history in the textbook, and if you're interested, you can read some more about it. If you don't understand how icons work, the temptation is to look at the icon and to trying to get my mouse to stay still. There we go. To look at the icon and say, okay, it's a picture of Jesus holding a book. All right, what are we going to look at next? But I can assure you that's not what's going on here. The artist here is not at all trying to say, this is, there was a guy who used to live around here about 500 years ago, and his name was Jesus, and he probably looked something like this. The artist here is not at all trying to say, this is what I think Jesus might have looked like. That's not at all how the icons work, and it's not at all the thought process of the artist here. The artist is not saying, this is what I think Jesus might have looked like. Instead, the artist is saying, this is who I believe Jesus was. What we have here is a profound statement of faith. The artist, a believing Christian, painting who he believes Jesus is. Take a good look at the icon. I mean, just take a look at it. Take it seriously for a couple of seconds there. The more you look at the icon, for most people, the stranger it begins to look. The weirder it starts to look. I've even had some students in class kind of get weirded out about it before I even start talking about the icon. And that's because there are some strange things going on in the icon. You can do this with a sheet of paper with your textbook photograph, or you can just look at the screen here. But if you cover up half of the icon long ways, like that, just take a look at it. And then cover up that half and look at the other half. You'll understand, I think, most of you at least will understand what I mean when I say that there's something strange about the icon. There are two different faces here. Let me go back. There's that half of the icon. and that half of the icon. Two different faces. Now, do you think the artist here is saying there was a guy who used to live around here named Jesus and about 500 years ago, and he had two different faces? Extreme makeover kind of business or something? That's not what's going on here. Okay. What you have here is a profound statement of faith. You will probably understand what I mean when I say that one of the faces is older than the other face. It's more drawn. It's that side that is holding the book. And then you have the more youthful face with a more open expression. The expression on that older face, the side holding the book, that expression, in fact, let's back up. Let's do it this way. That expression a bit harsh, a bit stern, not very happy. I've had some students suggest angry, upset, but certainly not very happy, that older face there. You also have a more youthful face with a much more open expression in the eyes. Here we have an artist saying, this is who I believe Jesus was. For believing Christians, Jesus is the unity of two natures, a human and divine. The Word became flesh. I'm just quoting to you out of the Gospel of John. We looked at it in class. The Word became flesh. The divine, sacred Logos thing became a human being. The unity of Godhead and manhood, it's sometimes called. The unity of the divine and the human. On the older side, we have the divine side. It's older because it's been around forever, since the beginning. Again, I'm just quoting John to you. That older side, which is holding the book. In the book are laws. And somebody's broken the laws. Guess whom? Us, people. Human beings have messed up. We've broken the laws. But then we have the more youthful appearance. The more youthful appearance as the divine becomes human, as that divine sacred Logos thing becomes flesh. Again, just saying to you what we saw in John's Gospel. With a more open expression on the face. And he's holding his fingers here in a posture that some of you might recognize. There's almost always some smart aleck who says that's the peace sign. Peace man. Yes, it's a peace sign. That's exactly what it is. It's the peace sign. More directly here is the posture of the fingers in more traditional forms of Christianity when the priest blesses the congregation at the end of a service, holding those two fingers up like that, and wishes the peace of the Lord to be on the congregation. Yeah, that's a peace sign. Where do you think the peace sign came from? A bunch of hippies sitting around a VW bus someday, and one of them said, "Hey man, we really need a sign." And someone held up two fingers and said, "Let's do this." Hey, that'll work. No, it all came from somewhere. Even the silly little peace sign came from somewhere. Originally a mark of blessing, wishing a blessing on someone. And you put all that together, and what you have here is a profound statement of faith. The Word becoming flesh. Somebody's broken the rules. Somebody's broken the rules. But I've come to offer peace anyway, come to bring a blessing of peace anyway. If you also look carefully at the icon, maybe in your textbook photograph, you'll see that the eyes are pointing in different directions. One eye is looking at you, this eye here. One eye is looking upward. There's a saying that developed in Eastern Christianity that means in the Byzantine world that Jesus had two eyes. With one eye he looked at the world, with his other eye he looked at his Father. The idea that Jesus is connected to the Father but also interested in the world, looking for people to minister to serve, and to help. And so what you have here is painting faith. Icons become very important for the brand of Christianity that develops in the Byzantine world, what today we call Eastern Orthodoxy. There's all kinds of separate churches within Eastern Orthodoxy. There's the Russian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, Antiochian Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox. There's an Iraqi Orthodox church. The Eastern Orthodox churches, just because of migration patterns to the United States, there's a lot of Greek Americans in this part of Florida, and so we have several Greek Orthodox churches around. And if you go inside, to take a look around, you'll see an awful lot of icons. and you'll meet people who understand how the icons work. Because icons aren't pictures that you look at just to see what something might look like, but they're pictures that give you something to think about, images to think about, and they work very differently than just ordinary paintings. Icons, of course, are more interesting to people who consider themselves believing Christians than to other people. But I think for just about anybody, whatever your own religious beliefs might be, the idea that you could paint a painting that expressed your faith, that you could paint your faith, is kind of an interesting idea, an interesting concept. Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion of the Byzantine world. Like I said, it goes by pretty quickly for us. It's an interesting time period, a fascinating time period, but it does go by pretty quickly, for us in this course at least.